The Texas sun hung low and heavy, painting the sky in streaks of orange and pink as Emily Carter stepped out into her backyard. July in this dusty little town was relentless, air thick with heat, the kind that stuck to your skin and made every breath feel like a chore. She gripped the hose, letting cool water spill over her rose bushes, their petals drooping under the day's punishment. That's when she saw him. Across the patchy wooden fence that separated her yard from Ruth Harper's, a man stood trimming the overgrown hedge. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a frame that looked carved from years of hard work. His faded gray t-shirt clung to his back, damp with sweat, and his arms flexed with each snip of the shears. Emily froze, water dripping onto her sneakers, as he turned his head and caught her staring. His eyes were sharp, a deep hazel that cut through the haze of the evening like a blade. For a second, neither of them moved. Then he nodded, a slow tilt of his head, and rasped out a low, "Hello." "Hey," Emily managed, her voice catching in her throat. She felt a flush creep up her neck, hotter than the sun ever could have managed. He wiped his brow with the back of his hand, leaving a streak of dirt across his weathered skin, and flashed a half-smile, crooked, easy, but with something lurking behind it she couldn't place. "Name's Jake," he said, stepping closer to the fence. His voice carried the weight of a man who'd seen more than he'd let on, rough around the edges but warm enough to pull her in. "Just moved in with Ruth." "Oh, right. Ruth's my neighbor," Emily replied, forcing her grip on the hose to steady. She'd known Ruth Harper for years, a widow in her 60s with a laugh that could fill a room and a knack for keeping her garden pristine. But this guy? He was new, and he didn't fit the quiet, predictable rhythm of their street. Jake leaned against the fence, the wood creaking under his weight. "You're good with those roses," he said, nodding toward her bushes. His gaze lingered, not on the flowers, but on her hands, still wet from the hose. She shifted, suddenly aware of the dirt under her nails, the way her old tank top stuck to her ribs. "Thanks," she muttered, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "They're a pain in this heat, but I manage." "Everything's a pain in this heat," he finished, his eyes flicking up to meet hers again. There was a spark there, something unspoken, like a match struck, but not yet dropped. Emily's pulse quickened, and she told herself it was just the humidity playing tricks on her. Before she could respond, the screen door of Ruth's house squeaked open, and the older woman stepped onto the porch. Ruth Harper was all elegance, even in a simple sundress, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. She carried herself like she owned the world, or at least this corner of it. Spotting Jake, she smiled, but when her gaze landed on Emily, that smile tightened just enough to notice. "Jake, honey, you about done out there?" Ruth called, her voice sweet but edged with something harder. She crossed the yard in a few graceful strides and slid an arm around his waist, her fingers resting possessively on his hip. Up close, Emily could see the faint lines around Ruth's eyes deepen as she sized her up. "Yeah, just about," Jake said, his tone casual, though he didn't pull away from Ruth's grip. He glanced at Emily again, that half-smile still tugging at his lips. "Good to meet you." "Emily," she filled in, forcing a smile of her own. "Good to meet you, too." Ruth's arm tightened around Jake, her nails pressing into his shirt just enough to leave a mark. "Emily's been my neighbor forever," she said, her eyes locked on Jake now. "Always poking around in her garden, aren't you, dear?" There was a barb in that, dear, subtle but sharp. Emily bristled, her grip on the hose tightening until water sprayed sideways, splattering the dirt at her feet. "Just keeping the roses alive," she said, trying to keep her voice light. "Well, don't let us keep you," Ruth replied, her tone dismissing her like a fly buzzing too close. She turned to Jake, lowering her voice but not enough to hide it. "Don't talk to her too much, all right? She's got her own business to mind." Emily's stomach twisted, a mix of embarrassment and something hotter, like defiance, or maybe curiosity. Jake didn't respond to Ruth, just gave her a quick nod, but his eyes slid back to Emily for a split second. That look lingered in the air between them, heavy as the heat, before Ruth tugged him toward the house. As the screen door slammed shut behind them, Emily stood there, hose still dripping, her heart thudding against her ribs. She didn't know why Ruth's words stung so much, or why Jake's glance felt like it had peeled back a layer of her she didn't even know was there. She shook it off, turning the water off with a jerk, but the image of him stayed. Those hands, that voice, the way he'd stood at the fence like he belonged there. Inside her house, she dropped onto the couch, the ceiling fan humming overhead. Through the window, she could still see Ruth's yard, the hedge half-trimmed, the shears left leaning against the fence. And then she heard it, a low murmur of voices, too muffled to make out, but enough to know Ruth was talking fast, her tone sharp. Jake's reply was quieter, steady, but it didn't calm whatever storm Ruth was brewing. Emily leaned closer to the glass, her breath fogging it up. She couldn't shake the feeling that something had just started, something she wasn't sure she wanted to stop. The next few days dragged by in a haze of heat and restless energy. Emily couldn't shake Jake from her mind, those hazel eyes, the way his voice rumbled like distant thunder. She told herself it was nothing, just a neighborly hello gone sideways in her head, but every time she stepped outside, her gaze drifted to Ruth's yard like a moth to a porch light. It started small. She'd catch him mowing the lawn, the hum of the machine cutting through the still air, his shirt sleeves rolled up to his elbows. Or he'd be hauling trash bins to the curb, muscles shifting under his skin as he moved. Each time, their eyes would meet, brief, electric, and he'd nod, maybe toss her a quick, "Hey, Emily," before going back to whatever he was doing. She'd nod back, her throat tight, pretending she wasn't counting the seconds until it happened again. One evening, she was wrestling with a jammed mailbox, the metal creaking under her grip, when Jake appeared on the other side of the street. He crossed over, boots crunching on the gravel, and stopped a few feet away. "Need a hand?" he asked, his tone low and easy. Emily glanced up, her hair sticking to her neck in the humidity. "It's fine, just stuck," she said, though her fingers fumbled more now that he was watching. He stepped closer, close enough that she caught the faint scent of sweat and cedar on him, and reached past her. His arm brushed hers, just a graze, but it sent a jolt through her like static. With one firm yank, the mailbox popped open. "There you go," he said, stepping back, but not too far. His eyes lingered on her, steady and unreadable, and she felt her cheeks burn. "Thanks," she muttered, pulling out a stack of junk mail to hide the shake in her hands. "You're handy." "Comes with the territory," he replied, shoving his hands in his pockets. He nodded toward her roses, their petals curling in the heat. "You're good with those. Ever think about doing more than just your yard?" She laughed, a nervous sound that slipped out before she could stop it. "What, like Ruth's jungle over there?" "I'd need a chainsaw." Jake's mouth twitched, almost a smile. "She'd kill me if I let anyone touch it. But yeah, you've got a knack." His fingers brushed the edge of her mailbox, rough against the smooth metal, and her stomach flipped at the thought of those hands tending something softer, like her roses. Or her. Before she could respond, a shadow fell across the street. Ruth stood on her porch, arms crossed, her sundress fluttering in the faint breeze. "Jake," she called, her voice slicing through the moment. "Dinner's ready." He turned, giving Ruth a wave, but his eyes flicked back to Emily. "See you around," he said, and there was something in the way he said it, low, deliberate, that stuck with her long after he'd crossed back to Ruth's side. That night, Emily couldn't sleep. The heat pressed in, even with the fan whirring, and her mind kept replaying that brush of his arm, the weight of his gaze. She got up, padding to the kitchen for a glass of water, when she saw him again, outside, alone, shirtless in the dim glow of Ruth's porch light. He was digging in the garden, the muscles in his back rippling with each shove of the shovel. The air felt thicker, watching him like that, and she didn't realize she'd stepped closer to the window until her breath fogged the glass. He paused, wiping sweat from his brow, and looked up, straight at her. Her heart slammed against her ribs, but she didn't move. Neither did he. Then he raised a hand, a slow gesture that wasn't quite a wave, more like an invitation. "Want to help?" he called, his voice carrying across the quiet night. She should have said no. Should have turned back to bed and let the heat swallow her restless thoughts. But her feet were already moving, bare against the cool floor, out the door, across the dew-damp grass. She stopped at the fence, the wood rough under her palms, and he met her there, shovel still in hand. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his tone teasing but soft, like he already knew the answer. "Too hot," she said, which was true enough. His chest glistened in the faint light, and she forced her eyes up to his face. "What about you?" "Same," he said, leaning the shovel against the fence. He stepped closer, the space between them shrinking until she could feel the warmth radiating off him. "Thought I'd work it off." Her mouth went dry. "Digging holes?" Something like that. His eyes searched hers, and for a moment, she thought he might say more, something real, something that had cracked this fragile thing wide open. But then the phone rang inside Ruth's house, sharp and insistent, shattering the silence. Jake tensed, glancing back at the porch. "That'll be her," he said, almost to himself. The ringing stopped, and Ruth's voice drifted out, muffled but urgent. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Better go." "Yeah," Emily said, stepping back, her bare feet sinking into the grass. "Night, Jake." "Night, Emily." He grabbed the shovel and turned away, but not before she caught the flicker in his eyes, something restless, something caged. Back in her kitchen, she slumped against the counter, the glass of water forgotten. Her phone buzzed, a missed call from Ruth, no voicemail. Her stomach sank. What did Ruth want at this hour? And why did it feel like she'd just stepped into something she couldn't walk away from? The next morning, Emily woke to a sky bruised with gray clouds, the air heavy with the promise of rain. Her head buzzed from a sleepless night, Ruth's missed call gnawing at her like a splinter she couldn't pull out. She dragged herself outside to check the roses, anything to keep her hands busy, her mind off Jake. But the sight of Ruth's trash bins at the curb stopped her cold. One lid was propped open, a crumpled newspaper spilling out. Normally, she'd have walked past, but something about the faded ink caught her eye, a grainy photo, half-torn, of a man with dark hair and a jawline that felt too familiar. She tugged it free, smoothing it against her thigh. The headline read, "Man vanishes after bar fight in Lubbock, police seek leads." The date was 3 years old, the details sparse, but the face, it could have been Jake. Same build, same tilt of the head. The caption named him Jacob Sullivan, 38. Her breath hitched. It wasn't proof, not really, but the coincidence clawed at her. She stuffed the paper into her pocket, glancing at Ruth's house. The curtains were still, no sign of life, but the weight of that photo pressed against her leg like a loaded gun. All day, she wrestled with it. Was it him? Why was Ruth keeping this? By dusk, the clouds had thickened, the air electric with an oncoming storm. She was pruning her roses, thorns pricking her fingers, when Jake's voice broke through the quiet. "Those look mad at you," he said, leaning over the fence. He held a cigarette, the tip glowing faintly as he took a drag. His shirt was unbuttoned halfway, sleeves rolled up, and the sight of him, casual, unguarded, sent a shiver down her spine despite the heat. "They're just picky," she said, brushing blood from her thumb. She wanted to ask about the paper, the name, but the words stuck. Instead, she nodded at his cigarette. "Didn't peg you for a smoker." "Old habit," he said, exhaling a thin stream of smoke. "Comes back when I'm restless." His eyes flicked to her hand, then her face, lingering too long. "You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Maybe I have," she muttered, half under her breath. His brow furrowed, but before he could press, she stepped closer to the fence. "What keeps you restless, Jake?" He didn't answer right away. Just watched her, the cigarette dangling between his fingers, ash falling to the dirt. Then he smirked, a slow, dangerous curve of his lips. "You're digging, huh? Am I wrong to?" She shot back, her pulse racing. The air between them crackled, thick with things unsaid. He took a step forward, closing the gap until the fence was the only thing keeping them apart. She could smell the tobacco on him now, mixed with earth and sweat, and it made her dizzy. "Some things are better left buried," he said, his voice low, almost a growl. He flicked the cigarette into the grass, grinding it out with his boot, and leaned in. His breath brushed her cheek, warm and rough, and her knees went weak. "But you're not the type to let sleeping dogs lie, are you?" Her heart slammed against her ribs. She could have pulled back, could have laughed it off, but she didn't. "Maybe I like the chase," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. His eyes darkened, a storm brewing behind them. "Careful what you chase, Emily. Might catch something you can't handle." His hand rested on the fence, inches from hers, and she swore she felt the heat of it through the wood. For a moment, she thought he'd reach over, bridge that last gap, but then he straightened, breaking the spell. "Come over here," he said, nodding toward Ruth's yard. "Got a patch that needs work. Could use an extra pair of hands." She shouldn't have gone. Not with that newspaper burning a hole in her pocket, not with Ruth's call still unanswered. But her feet moved anyway, crossing the line into his territory. He handed her a small shovel, their fingers brushing as she took it, deliberate, she thought, from the way his grip lingered. They knelt side by side, digging into the dry soil, the silence stretching taut between them. "You ever run from something?" she asked, keeping her eyes on the dirt. Her hands trembled, and she blamed the shovel's weight. He paused, his shovel hovering midair. "Yeah," he said finally, his voice rougher than before. "Doesn't mean it stops chasing you." She looked up, caught by the raw edge in his words. His face was close, too close, his jaw tight, his eyes searching hers like he was daring her to ask more. She could have sworn the space between them shrank, the air humming with something wild and unspoken. Her lips parted, a question on the tip of her tongue, when a flash of lightning split the sky. Jake flinched, glancing up as thunder rumbled in the distance. "Storm's coming," he said, standing abruptly. He offered her a hand, pulling her up with a grip that was firm, steady, and sent a jolt through her arm. She stumbled into him, her palm flat against his chest for a heartbeat, hard muscle under damp cotton, before she yanked back, breathless. "Better get inside," he said, but he didn't move, just stood there, watching her like he was waiting for something. Raindrops started to fall, slow and fat, dotting his shoulders, her hair. She nodded, stepping away, but his voice stopped her at the fence. "Emily." She turned. His eyes were locked on her, intense, unguarded. "Don't go digging too deep." "Not yet." She didn't answer, just ran back to her house as the rain picked up, her pulse pounding louder than the thunder. Inside, she pulled the newspaper from her pocket, staring at that blurry photo. Jacob Sullivan. Jake. The pieces didn't fit, not yet, but they were starting to form a picture she wasn't sure she wanted to see. And across the yard, through the rain-streaked window, she saw Jake light another cigarette, the glow flickering in the dark like a warning she couldn't ignore. The rain came down in sheets all night, drumming against Emily's roof like it was trying to break in. She barely slept, the newspaper photo of Jacob Sullivan staring at her from the kitchen counter where she'd left it. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the air muggy and the ground slick with mud. She stepped outside, the damp grass cold against her feet, and saw Ruth's car gone from the driveway. Jake's truck was still there, though, parked crooked like he'd rolled in late. She was yanking weeds from her rose bed, her hands caked with dirt, when she heard the crunch of boots behind her. "Morning," Jake said, his voice rough like he hadn't slept either. He stood at the fence, a mug of coffee in hand, steam curling up into the humid air. His shirt was wrinkled, hair tousled, and those hazel eyes pinned her in place. "Morning," she replied, brushing her hands on her jeans. She wanted to ask about the paper, about Lubbock, but the words tangled in her throat. Instead, she nodded at his mug. "Ruth make that for you?" He smirked, taking a sip. "Nah, she's out. Garden club or something. I'm on my own today." His tone was light, but there was an edge to it, like he was testing her, waiting to see what she'd do with that information. "Good for you," she said, standing up. Her shirt clung to her back, sweat mixing with the dampness of the morning, and she caught him watching her, his gaze sliding down, then up, slow and deliberate. Her stomach flipped, a mix of nerves and something hotter she couldn't name. "Need help with those weeds?" he asked, setting the mug on the fence post. Before she could answer, he vaulted over the wooden slats, landing in her yard with a thud that sent mud splattering. He was close now, too close, his boots inches from her sneakers, his shadow falling over her. "I've got it," she said, but her voice wavered as he crouched beside her anyway, tugging a weed free with one swift pull. His arm brushed hers, rough skin against soft, and she froze, the air between them buzzing like a live wire. He didn't pull back, just kept working, his shoulder grazing hers with every move. "You're stubborn," he said, glancing sideways at her. His breath was warm, tinged with coffee, and it hit her like a shot of adrenaline. "Takes one to know one," she shot back, meeting his eyes. They were darker now, pupils wide, and for a second, she thought he might lean and close the gap, let that buzz turn into something real. Her heart hammered, loud enough she swore he could hear it. Then tires screeched on the street. Ruth's car jerked to a stop, the door flying open before the engine even cut off. She stormed across the lawn, her sundress flapping, her face twisted with something ugly. "What the hell's this?" she snapped, her voice sharp enough to slice through steel. Jake stood, slow and deliberate, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Just helping out," he said, calm as ever, but Ruth wasn't buying it. She turned on Emily, eyes blazing. "Helping out?" Ruth spat, stepping closer. "I see you sniffing around him every chance you get. You think I'm blind, Emily? Think I don't know what you're after?" Emily's face burned, anger flaring up to match the sting of embarrassment. "I'm not after anything," she said, standing to face her. He offered to help. "That's it." Ruth laughed, a harsh, brittle sound. "Oh, please. I've seen that look before. You're not fooling anyone." She jabbed a finger at Jake. "And you, don't think I don't notice you playing along." Jake's jaw tightened, but he didn't say a word, just watched Ruth like she was a rattlesnake coiled to strike. Emily's hands clenched into fists, the newspaper flashing in her mind. She could have thrown it in Ruth's face, asked what she was hiding about Jacob Sullivan, but something held her back. Fear, maybe. Or the way Jake was looking at her now, steady and quiet, like he was begging her to keep silent. Ruth huffed, turning on her heel. "Stay out of my yard, Emily. And off my man." She marched back to her house, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled. The silence that followed was suffocating. Emily stared at the muddy ground, her chest tight, until Jake's voice broke through. "She's got a temper," he said, low and dry, like it was no big deal. Yeah, well, she's not wrong to be mad, Emily muttered, kicking a clump of dirt. What are we doing, Jake? He stepped closer, his boots squelching in the mud. What do you want us to be doing? His voice was a rumble, soft but heavy, and when she looked up, he was right there, close enough to feel the heat rolling off him, to see the pole sticking in his neck. Her breath caught, her hands itching to reach out, to grab onto something solid before she fell. I don't know, she whispered, honest and raw. His hand lifted, hovering near her arm, fingers curling like he wanted to touch her but didn't trust himself. The space between them shrank, her lips parting as his gaze dropped to her mouth. A knock rattled her front door, sharp and insistent. They both flinched, the moment snapping like a twig. Emily turned, heart pounding, and saw Ruth's silhouette through the screen. Emily, Ruth called, her voice tight. We need to talk. Now. Jake cursed under his breath, stepping back. Go, he said, his tone clipped. I'll handle the rest. She didn't want to leave him standing there, mud-streaked and tense, but Ruth's knock came again, louder. Emily crossed the yard, her legs shaky, and opened the door. Ruth stood there, arms crossed, her face pale but her eyes hard as flint. You think you're clever, don't you? Ruth said, stepping inside without waiting for an invite. She held up her phone, the screen glowing with a call log, Emily's number, last night, unanswered. What were you doing out there with him? At midnight. Emily's stomach dropped. She hadn't even heard Ruth come back, hadn't thought she'd been seen. I couldn't sleep, she said, forcing her voice steady. We were just talking. Talking, Ruth echoed, her lip curling. I know what I saw. And I'm warning you, Emily, back off. You don't know what you're stepping into. The words hung there, heavy with threat. Emily opened her mouth to argue, but Ruth was already turning away, pausing at the door. He's mine, she said, quiet but fierce. Don't forget it. She left, the screen door banging shut, and Emily sank onto the couch, her head spinning. Through the window, she saw Jake back at the fence, watching her house. His eyes met hers, dark and unreadable, and then he turned away, disappearing into Ruth's yard. But Ruth's words echoed louder than the rain last night. You don't know what you're stepping into. And as Emily pulled that crumpled newspaper from her pocket, staring at Jake's grainy face, she realized Ruth might be right, and that scared her more than anything yet. The day simmered under a sky that couldn't decide whether to crack open or hold its breath. Emily spent it pacing her house, the newspaper photo of Jacob Sullivan crumpled in her fist 1 minute, smoothed out on the table the next. Ruth's words, you don't know what you're stepping into, looped in her head, tangled with Jake's steady gaze, his half-spoken warnings. By afternoon, thunder growled in the distance, and she knew something was about to give. She was in the kitchen, splashing water on her face to cool the heat crawling up her neck, when she heard it, tires on gravel, then silence. Through the window, she saw Ruth's car pull into the driveway, but Jake's truck was gone. Her stomach twisted. Where was he? And why did it feel like his absence was a warning she hadn't heeded? The storm hit just after dusk, wind howling through the trees, rain lashing the windows like it wanted in. Emily stood on her porch, the air electric, her hair whipping across her face. Lightning jagged across the sky, and in its flash, she saw him, Jake, hunched under Ruth's oak tree, soaked to the bone. His shirt clung to him, dark and heavy, and his head was bowed like he was fighting something bigger than the weather. She didn't think, just grabbed her jacket and ran, the rain stinging her skin as she crossed the yard. Jake, she shouted over the roar of the storm. He looked up, eyes wide, and for a second, she thought he'd bolt. But he didn't. He straightened, water streaming down his face, and met her halfway. What are you doing out here? She yelled, her voice nearly lost in the wind. Rain plastered her jacket to her arms, her sneakers sinking into the mud, but she didn't care. He was close now, his chest heaving, and the sight of him, raw, unguarded, lit something fierce inside her. Had to get out, he said, his voice rough, almost drowned by the thunder. Couldn't stay in there with her. He stepped closer, rain dripping from his hair, his jaw tight. Not after today. After Ruth. Emily asked, wiping water from her eyes. She came to my house, Jake. Told me to back off. What's she so afraid of? He didn't answer right away, just stared at her, his breath ragged, like he was wrestling with something heavy. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the sharp lines of his face, the tension in his shoulders. Then he grabbed her arm, his grip firm but not bruising, and pulled her under the tree's scant cover. The rain still hit them, but it dulled the noise, made the world feel smaller, just the two of them. She's afraid of losing me, he said finally, his voice low, cutting through the storm. But it's more than that. She knows things I've tried to bury. Emily's heart stuttered. She yanked the soaked newspaper from her pocket, holding it up between them. Like this? Jacob Sullivan, wanted in Lubbock? Is this you? His eyes darkened, a muscle ticking in his jaw. He took the paper, his fingers brushing hers, and stared at it like it was a ghost he'd hoped was dead. Yeah, he said, crumpling it in his fist. That's me. 3 years ago, I got in a fight. Guy pulled a knife. I hit back too hard. He didn't get up. I ran before the cops could pin it on me. She stepped back, rain blurring her vision, but he grabbed her wrist again, softer this time. I'm not that guy anymore, Emily. I've been running ever since, trying to start over. Ruth, she found out, tracked me down. Said she'd keep quiet if I stayed with her. Her breath caught, a mix of shock and something sharper, anger, maybe, or fear. She's blackmailing you? She calls it love, he said bitterly, letting go of her wrist. But it's a cage. And then he stopped, his eyes locking on hers, fierce and unguarded. You're the first thing that's made me want to break out. The words hit her like the thunder rolling overhead, shaking something loose inside. She stepped closer, rain streaming down her face, her hands trembling. Then why don't you? She whispered, her voice raw. Why stay? He didn't answer with words. Instead, he reached for her, his hand sliding to her waist, pulling her against him. Her jacket bunched under his grip, her body pressed to his, wet, warm, solid. She gasped, her hands landing on his chest, feeling the thud of his heart through the soaked fabric. His other hand cupped her face, thumb brushing her cheek, rain mingling with the heat of his skin. Because of this, he said, his voice a growl, low and desperate. Because I can't stop thinking about you. His face was inches from hers, his breath hot against her lips, and her world narrowed to the space between them, the rain, the wind, the wild pulse in her veins. She tilted her head, her lips parting, and his eyes dropped to her mouth, a question and a promise all at once. Thunder crashed, so loud it shook the ground, and they flinched apart, the moment splintering. But he didn't let go, not fully. His hand stayed on her waist, fingers digging in like he was anchoring himself. Run with me, he said, his voice ragged. Tonight. We could leave all this. Ruth, the past, everything. Her head spun. Jake. She couldn't finish, couldn't think past the storm in his eyes, the way her body ached to close that gap again. Lightning flashed, and in its glare, she saw Ruth standing at her porch, a silhouette against the light, watching them. She's back, Emily breathed, stepping out of his grip. Ruth didn't move, just stared, her posture rigid with fury. Then she turned, disappearing inside, and a second later, the porch light flicked off. Jake cursed, running a hand through his dripping hair. She's gonna call them, he said, his voice tight. The cops. She's got proof, letters, photos. She'll turn me in if I don't go back. Emily's stomach dropped. You don't know that. I do, he snapped, then softened, reaching for her hand. His fingers laced with hers, rough and urgent. Come with me, Emily, or I'm gone by morning. Your choice. She stared at him, rain pooling in her shoes, her heart slamming against her ribs. The newspaper was a sodden mess on the ground, Ruth's thread a shadow closing in. She wanted to say yes, wanted to run, to feel his hand in hers under a different sky, but fear clawed at her, loud as the storm. I need time, she said, pulling her hand free. I can't. Just give me a minute to think. He nodded, jaw tight, and stepped back into the rain. I'll be at the truck. 1 hour. Then he was gone, swallowed by the dark, leaving her alone under the tree, the storm raging around her. Inside, she sank to the floor, her soaked clothes dripping onto the wood. Through the window, she saw Ruth's house, lights on, curtains twitching. And in the distance, Jake's truck idled, headlights cutting through the rain like a lifeline she wasn't sure she could grab. The rain didn't let up, hammering the roof as Emily stood frozen in her living room, water pooling around her feet. Jake's words, 1 hour, echoed louder than the storm, each tick of the clock a stab in her chest. She paced, her soaked jacket dripping, her mind a tangle of fear and longing. The newspaper lay in a soggy heap by the door, Jacob Sullivan staring up at her like a ghost she couldn't shake. And through the window, Ruth's house glowed, a silent threat pulsing in the dark. She grabbed her phone, fingers trembling as she scrolled to Ruth's number. Maybe she could talk her down, buy Jake time, anything to stop this spiral. But the line rang once, then cut to voicemail, Ruth's clipped voice filling the silence. Leave a message. Emily hung up, her breath shallow. She didn't have a plan, didn't have answers, just the image of Jake's truck idling in the rain, waiting for her to choose. Lightning cracked, lighting up the yard, and she saw him, Jake, back in Ruth's garden, pacing near the hedge. His shirt was a dark smear against his skin, his head bowed, hands clenched like he was fighting himself as much as the storm. Something snapped inside her. She couldn't wait, couldn't think anymore. She yanked the door open and ran, mud splashing up her legs, rain blinding her as she crossed into his orbit. "Jake," she shouted, her voice raw against the wind. He turned, eyes wide, and met her at the fence, his boots slipping in the muck. "You're still here?" she gasped, breathless, rain streaming down her face. "Couldn't leave," he said, his voice rough, almost lost in the storm. "Not without you." He reached over the fence, his hand finding hers, fingers lacing tight and desperate. His skin was cold from the rain, but his grip burned, pulling her closer until the wood dug into her ribs. "I don't know what I'm doing," she admitted, her free hand gripping the fence to steady herself. "Ruth, she's gonna call the cops. She saw us. I can't." "Stop thinking about her," he cut in, his voice sharp but trembling. He tugged her hand, urging her over the fence, and she climbed, her sneakers slipping, his arms catching her as she landed in his yard. She stumbled into him, her hands flat against his chest, his heartbeat thudding under her palms. He didn't let go, just held her there, rain dripping from his hair onto her face, his breath ragged. "I can't stop this," he said, low and fierce, his hands sliding to her waist. "I tried. I can't." His fingers tightened, pulling her flush against him, her soaked shirt sticking to his. Her breath hitched, her body pressed to his, hard plains and wet heat, and every nerve lit up like the lightning overhead. "Then don't," she whispered, tilting her head up. His eyes locked on hers, dark and wild, and for a heartbeat, the world held still, just the rain, the thunder, the space between their lips shrinking. Then he moved, his hand cupping her face, thumb brushing her jaw, and he kissed her. It was soft at first, tentative, like he was testing the edge of a cliff. His lips pressed to hers, warm despite the cold, rain mingling with the taste of him. She froze, stunned by the rush of it, then answered, her hands sliding up his chest to his shoulders, gripping tight. The kiss deepened, his mouth moving harder, hungrier, a low sound rumbling in his throat as he pulled her closer. Her fingers dug into his shirt, his hand splayed across her back, holding her like she might vanish if he let go. Thunder crashed, shaking the ground, but they didn't stop. His lips trailed to her jaw, her neck, his breath hot against her skin, and she arched into him, a shiver racing down her spine. "Emily," he murmured, his voice a rasp, and it broke something in her: fear, doubt, everything but this. She pulled him back, kissing him again, fierce and reckless, her hands threading into his wet hair. They stumbled back, hitting the hedge, branches snagging her jacket, his shirt. His hands roamed her sides, firm but careful, and she felt the world tilt, the rain, the mud, the heat of him consuming her. She didn't care about Ruth, about Lubbock, about anything but the way he held her, like she was the only thing keeping him from drowning. Then headlights sliced through the dark Ruth's car, screeching to a stop. The kiss broke, both of them gasping, turning as Ruth stormed out, an umbrella snapping open in her hand. "You son of a bitch," she screamed, her voice cutting through the storm. She marched toward them, her face twisted with rage, a manila envelope clutched tight. Jake stepped in front of Emily, his body tense. "Ruth, don't." "Don't what?" she spat, shoving the envelope at him. It hit his chest and fell, spilling photos into the mud, blurry shots of a bar, a bloody fist, a man on the ground. "You think you can run off with her? I've got everything: letters, witnesses. One call, Jake, and you're done." Emily's stomach lurched, her hands still tingling from his touch. "Ruth, wait," she started, but Ruth whirled on her, eyes blazing. "Shut up," Ruth snapped. "You want him? Take him. See how long you last when they drag him away." She yanked her phone from her pocket, fingers shaking as she dialed, the screen glowing in the rain. Jake grabbed Emily's arm, pulling her back. "We've got to go," he said, his voice urgent, low in her ear. "Now." He tugged her toward the truck, but she froze, Ruth's voice rising behind them. "Yes, officer, I've got a fugitive here," and the weight of it crashed down. "Jake, I can't," she said, her voice breaking. His grip tightened, his eyes pleading, rain streaming down his face. "You can," he said, stepping closer, his forehead brushing hers. "Run with me, Emily. Please." His hands framed her face, the kiss still burning between them, and for a second, she saw it, a life on the road, his hand in hers, no more hedges or secrets holding them back. But then sirens wailed in the distance, faint but growing louder, and Ruth's laugh cut through the night, bitter and triumphant. Jake's hands dropped, his jaw clenching. "Last chance," he said, backing toward the truck, the door already open. Emily's heart tore in two. She took a step toward him, toward the unknown, then stopped, mud sucking at her shoes, fear clawing up her throat. "I'm sorry," she whispered, barely audible over the storm. He stared at her, pain flashing in his eyes, then nodded once, sharp and final. "Take care, Emily." He climbed into the truck, the engine roaring to life, and peeled out, headlights vanishing into the rain. Ruth dropped her phone, the call still live, and sank to her knees, sobbing into the mud. Emily stood there, soaked and shaking, the taste of Jake still on her lips, the sound of sirens closing in. She'd made her choice, but it didn't feel like winning. The rain tapered off just before dawn, leaving the world quiet and bruised. Emily stood on her porch, her clothes still damp, mud caked on her sneakers, the taste of Jake's kiss a ghost on her lips. The street was empty now, Ruth's house dark, the truck's tire tracks swallowed by the wet earth. Sirens had come and gone, their wail fading into the night, but no lights had flashed, no cuffs had clicked. Either Ruth's call hadn't stuck, or Jake had slipped through the cracks again. She sank onto the porch swing, the wood creaking under her weight, and pulled her knees to her chest. The air smelled of rain and roses, heavy with the weight of what she'd let go. In her hand, crumpled and soggy, was a note she'd found tucked under her door, Jake's handwriting, scrawled in haste, "You know where to find me." No address, no promise, just a thread left dangling, daring her to pull it. Across the yard, Ruth's hedge stood battered by the storm, branches snapped, leaves scattered like secrets spilled. Emily stared at it, her chest tight with a hollow ache. She could still feel his hands on her, his grip on her waist, the press of his lips, the way he looked at her like she was the only thing tethering him to the ground. She'd said no, stayed rooted, but the freedom in his eyes haunted her, a road she hadn't taken stretching out in her mind. The sun crept up, weak and pale, painting the wet grass gold. A breeze rustled the roses, their petals trembling, and she thought she heard the faint growl of an engine far off, or maybe it was just the wind playing tricks. She stood, folding the note into her pocket, and stepped inside, the door clicking shut behind her. On the counter, her phone buzzed, Ruth's name flashing, then fading as the call dropped. Emily didn't pick up. She didn't need to hear the venom, the victory, or whatever Ruth had left to say. Instead, she poured a glass of water, her fingers brushing the rim, and sat by the window, watching the world wake up. The ache didn't fade, but it settled, a quiet companion she'd carry for a while. Jake was gone, maybe for good, maybe not. She'd chosen safety, the familiar dirt under her feet, but his note burned against her hip, a question she couldn't answer yet. The open road was out there, winding through the Texas plains, and part of her wondered if she'd ever chase it down. "Hey, thanks for sticking with me through the heat of the hedge. What do you think? Did Emily make the right call staying behind? Or should she have jumped in that truck with Jake?" Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm dying to hear what you'd do. And if you loved this ride, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. More stories are coming your way, and trust me, you won't want to miss what's next. See you in the next one.